Just give me a moment to make sure my phone is quiet. The amazing world of connectivity can sometimes be a little annoying. All right, that is up and running. Let's get back to our screen. And let me do that. All right, I think everything is in place. Hooray. Is everybody having a good preparation towards Thanksgiving? It's the definitely the most Jewish of the American holidays.
Still working on it.
Yes, one is in a turkey.
I don't think Penelope has the turkey in the oven just yet. That'll wait till tomorrow.
I have to pre-cook it so I can bring it up to Orlando.
Ah. Well, I think we've waited our usual cushion to go ahead and get started. So let's get down to business. We are picking up on Genesis 39 in one of the more famous scenes, but often misunderstood. Well, I shouldn't say misunderstood, understood only from a surface reading. It's a very interesting take on what happens when there is a conflict of what some people want, especially powerful people, and what other people in vulnerable positions may or may not end up trying to do under those circumstances. This is, of course, the chapter where we see the episode between Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar. We're only going to call her Mrs. Potiphar because we are not given a full name for her. So we're just going to stick with that, even though there's attempts to find different names for her in the Midrash. We're just going to stick with Mrs. Potiphar. But let's make sure we remember the story so far. Prior to this chapter, Joseph had been sold down into Egypt as a slave. Joseph was hated and resented by his brothers, who at first plotted his murder, but then relented and decided to simply throw him into a pit, and then decided rather than throwing him into a pit where he would just starve to death, they could sell him and make money and get rid of him at the same time. Very, very enterprising of them. Joseph ends up down in Egypt, and as we're going to see, he is going to be purchased as a slave and put into a position of authority in his household. And that is going to lead to a conflict. It's going to lead to a battle over what's going on. So we're going to leave that just as our opening introduction. Anyone unclear on where we are so far in the narrative of the Torah, or can we go ahead and start chapter 39? Hearing no objection, so moved. When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, a certain Egyptian, Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he stayed in the house of his Egyptian master. So Joseph is doing very well, and as we're going to see, when his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord lent success to everything he undertook, he took a liking to Joseph. He made him his personal attendant and put him in charge of his household, placing in his hands all that he owned. So Joseph's good ability and fortune is something that catches the eye of Potiphar. And so Potiphar gives him more and more positions of power and authority because everything Joseph does seems to turn out right. Whatever he touches turns to gold, if you will. He is a rainmaker, to use the modern entrepreneurial term. And from the time that the Egyptian put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed his house for Joseph's sake, so that the blessing of the Lord was upon everything that he owned in the house and outside, or in the field, more specifically in the Hebrew. So Joseph is indeed successful, and that success does rub off on his owner. It's important to remember that as far as Joseph has risen within the household, he is still an enslaved person. He is still the property of Potiphar. And Joseph is not being given much of a choice in where he's going to work or what work he's doing, but he definitely seems to be in a more comfortable position than those that are working perhaps in the fields. But he is enslaved nonetheless, and that should not be forgotten in this conversation. And in fact, it will be essential for understanding his position vis-a-vis Mrs. Potiphar in just a few verses. So, verse 6, we continue. He, meaning Potiphar, left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and with him there, he paid attention to nothing save the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. Beautiful verse for setting up a second half. So we see that he is being given full control over everything in the house except for his food. A lot of discussion among different commentators, especially some of the modern ones, that the Egyptians always had a distaste for the Hebrews and how the Hebrews handled their food, something that we see again later on with Joseph and his brothers when they come down to Egypt and he is in disguise. And so that might have been the reluctance of Potiphar to allow Joseph to handle that. Additionally, many people read this idea of putting everything in his house except his bread as a euphemism, with the bread being the stand-in for his wife, meaning Mrs. Potiphar, which of course works with the rather abrupt turn in the second half of this verse, where we are reminded that Joseph was well-built and handsome.
Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead.
Quick question. In the Fox translation and commentary, it points out that the only other person who is described in exactly these terms, fair of form and fair to look at, is Rachel.
That's right. The idea of being this beautiful person, Joseph really does take after his mom.
And beauty can be a curse.
Well, it's a beauty or a blessing, as we will have to wrestle with, just as Joseph is going to have to wrestle in just a few seconds. But this notion that Joseph was well built, that Joseph was handsome, why do we believe that is still part of the same verse? I mean, after all, if we were reading this in English and there were no numbers on the page, no chapter, no verses, which remember were a much later invention by Christian scholars in the Middle Ages, why would we think that now Joseph was well built and handsome was part of the same unit of thought, the same concept block as he left all that he had, rather than the beginning of the next line? After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." I mean, after all, the fact that he's attractive seems to have much more in common with the contents of verse number 7 than it does with verse number 6. So how do we know that now Joseph was well built and handsome is part of verse 6 rather than verse 7? Well, the trope tells us so. It is true that the chapters and numbers were delineated in their current form by Christian scholars in the Middle Ages, and that we have by and large adopted them as a convenient tool for referring to things in the Tanakh. However, prior to that, we did have our own breakdown of the verses in particular, and that breakdown goes according to the Masoretic text, goes according to the trope of the Tiberian variety. If you are familiar with Hebrew but not chanting, you may have always wondered what these additional little symbols are that are not letters and not vowels. And those are the cantillation markers. Many people think of the cantillation markers as being primarily musical because, after all, we do sing them. They do have a melody that associates to them, but their primary purpose is grammatical. Their primary purpose is to tell us which words fit together in a phrase or clause, which words do not go together in a phrase or clause, which words are part of a larger unit, what we call verses, which is not the same as a sentence, as is very clear here in verse number 6, because we have more than enough elements to make two separate sentences. But the trope tells us that after the food that he ate, that we continue talking about Joseph's good looks, and that is indeed part of that same unit of thought rather than being put as part of number 7. Now, why? Like I said, this may be a reflection that this concept of what of Joseph's rise to position is leaving out is the position of Mrs. Potiphar, and that there may be some euphemism involved in that idea. But that is something that is hinted at, partly because the second half is contained within the trope of the overall verse. Now, trope is, like I said, a melody, but it is also grammatical. And the fact that we would put a full stop or the double colon, as we see here at the end, tells us that that is all one unit. But the individual trope markers can also have a lot of importance. And we're going to see that at the beginning of verse 8. So remember, at the end of verse 7, she asked him to come lie with her, but he refused, right? Very nice. We put that into a little period, but again, it's all part of one verse. But that phrase, but he refused, is right here at the beginning. And those of you that are familiar with trope will recognize above it the very rare trope. It's called a shalshelet. And I have a larger picture of it here in the handout. And it looks like a wavy, jagged line. And it is a wavy, jagged melody. In this particular verse, it would sound something like this. Vaymahen. It's a waving, fluctuating tone. And in Torah, it only appears 4 times. And we're going to talk about all 4 of them. This is number 1 for us, although it's not number 1 in the order of their occurrences. But that trope marker seems to have some significance of grammar, not only of melody. That is to say that its fanciness is not just there to impress, but it is there to impress an idea upon us. And that's something that we're going to wrestle with in our commentary. And really, you can almost begin to get a feel for it, where but he refused is a very short, simple statement of position. But you must be wondering, at least I hope you're wondering, was this refusal easy? Was this refusal hard? Was this refusal something that came to him quickly? Was this refusal something that he had to wrestle with? And if we just look at the next part of verse 8 and verse 9, we can maybe answer a few more of those questions. He said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master gives no thought to anything to his house, and all that he owns he has placed in my hands. He wields no more authority in this house than I, and has withheld nothing from me except yourself, since you are his wife. How then could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God?" So the content of these 2 verses, again, helps us understand that since Joseph is saying he has withheld nothing except you, that when we were back here in verse 6, where he has withheld nothing except the food, and since Joseph is not mentioning the food in his rebuttal to her, then indeed maybe that food is a euphemism for his wife. But more importantly, this is a very, very long explanation of no. After all, he could have just said he refused, and then we could go on to verse number 10. Instead, Joseph takes, for the Torah, a very long time to explain the reasons for his refusal. And that additional time might be telling us something about the inner life of Joseph in coming to this decision. Because you'll notice that he is not saying that he doesn't want to. He is saying specifically that it would be a betrayal of his master, and that it would be a betrayal before God, that this would be something wrong for God. So he gives 2 different explanations for why he is going to say no. 1, because it would be a betrayal of Potiphar, and 2, because it would be a betrayal of God. But technically, he could have gotten by with just, he refused. Now, why would he feel necessary to give a lengthy and descriptive explanation of why he won't be with her? You got an idea, John?
Well, it's just like where it's used in Genesis 19 with Lot, being dragged away from Sodom, he hesitates. And that's where the shashlet is used there, where he's not quite sure what to do, and he has to really be prodded to do so. But here he's prodding himself.
But for prodding himself, why would he be in a particularly tricky spot when coming to this decision? Right? I mean, we could say on the one hand, and we'll look at some commentators who are talking about that, maybe Mrs. Potiphar was very beautiful. Maybe he really wanted to be with her physically.
Yeah.
And then he also decided he didn't want to. But I think we also have to recognize he is a slave. He is saying no to the mistress of the house. And that's not an easy thing to do, regardless of his own personal wishes, which we will talk a lot more about in the commentaries. We just have to be sensitive to the position that he is in, even though he may be number 2 in the entire house, or indeed, as he puts it, he has the equal authority in the house as Potiphar, except with regards to Mrs. Potiphar. He still is saying no to her, and saying no to your master's wife is not a good position to take if you want to have a good relationship in the house. Yes, it might be safer, but it's still putting him at odds with her, and that is a bad position for a slave to be in.
He's struggling. We open up. He went down to Egypt. Lot went down to Sodom and Gomorrah. So there is this tension that's being reflected in the text through the shashlet, that he's struggling. He is now has his own inner lingering, going back and forth. As you said, he's a slave. He's refusing his master's wife, but yet he still knows Adonai is God, and that he has certain duties, just to be a good Jew, to be part of his family and the moral example his father set.
Right. And that idea that he is struggling is very much behind many of the interpretations of why the Shalshelet is here. And to recognize his struggle rather than merely read through it of, Vaimaen, he refused, or in English, but he refused. To read just the plain words without any additional hint of the meaning that comes from the trope, the grammar markers, is to miss out on this. Now, we can still debate on why he was struggling because of his weak position as a slave, struggling because of his own desires, struggling because of his distance from home and his saturation in Egyptian life. We can debate why he was struggling. But without that Shalshelet, we wouldn't know that he was struggling. Without that Shalshelet, he would look like somebody who was a man of saintly virtue. We're going to see that, he ends up getting in trouble over this. But at least here in verse 8, he seems to be the paragon of self-restraint. The Shalshelet opens up the idea that perhaps there's more to be learned from his encounter with Mrs. Potiphar than just that he was upright and noble in every way. And that is not to denigrate Joseph, but it is to make him more human and to give the rest of us more insight into what it is to struggle in these types of situations, and why having the struggle is not akin to failure. Having to struggle is the first step towards success, and that's all going to be contained by the fact that this special trope is opening our eyes to something that's happening here that we might otherwise miss. So let's finish up the story of Mrs. Potiphar and see the trouble he gets into. And much as she, that's right. And much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her. One such day, he came into the house to do his work, none of the household being there inside. She caught hold of him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. When she saw that he had left it in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, "Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. And when he heard me screaming at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and got away and fled outside. So this is her beginning to come up with a cover-up to implicate him and to punish him for what he had done, for refusing to be with her. Obviously, she couldn't just go to her husband and say, make him sleep with me, because that would not be allowed even by Egyptian standards. And so when he refused to give in, she had to make an example of him to others. One little aside, and then we're going to turn to our commentaries. This use of the term dali in the English translation lines up with the phrase litzachek. And this is one of those places where we see that the phrase litzachek, which can mean to play, can have sexual overtones to it. And this is one of the reasons why when we see the story of Ishmael and Yitzchak, and Ishmael is using the phrase litzachek for his activity with Yitzchak, whose name is based off that very same root word. People believe that Ishmael was engaging in different types of immorality. It's also why when Isaac himself, when he is older, is spotted playing with Rivka when they are pretending to be brother and sister, that it becomes obvious that they are not siblings. So sometimes people object to that interpretation of both of Ishmael as well as to Isaac, but we can see very clearly from the Torah's language here in verse 14 that indeed litzachek has a sexual overtone in some context. All right, so we're not going to go through the rest of the story together. Please keep reading as always. Let's move to our commentary. So first, a little bit about the importance of trope, beginning from the Talmud. And Rabbi Shefatia said that Rabbi Yochanan said, concerning anyone who reads in the Torah without a melody, the verse states, so too I gave them statutes that were not good and judgments whereby they should not live. The idea being that if you read the Torah without trope, you are essentially perverting what God gave us. You are changing the meaning of it. You are taking what was given and making it the opposite of what God wanted. And indeed, without trope, there are many places where the text would be confusing. Here we have a confusion of the inner struggle of Joseph, but in other places we might have confusion of legal matters. So indeed, we read with trope, and there are different melody systems that go with it. So the Ashkenazic has many different traditions. The Sephardim have many traditions. The Hasidim have many different traditions. But all of us use the same pattern of what pauses and what junctions we use in the use of trope. So it may sound a little different in the melody, but in terms of the grammar that is being carried through all the different congregations, it is always the same. And that keeps us correct. It also, by the way, makes it easier to remember, which is another important point. So I mentioned that Shalshelet comes up 3 other times. So let's take a look at those 3 other times to see the pattern. And while he lingered, who is lingering here? This is Lot. This is Lot hesitating to leave the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah when the destruction is at hand. While he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand and upon the hand of his wife and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside of the city. So in context, it seems that as much as Lot is recognizing the need to leave the city before the destruction, part of him wants to stay. Lot is not considered the hero of this story. Lot is not considered to be a great person. He is worthy of being saved, just barely, but he is deeply flawed. And this Shalshelet over the word lingered opens up that understanding a little more clearly, that he was partly involved in the life and the materialism of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he was having a hard time leaving all of that behind. Likewise, in Genesis 24, we see the servant of Abraham who is looking for the match that will become the bride for Isaac, and he said, Lord, my God, Lord, God of my master, Avraham, I pray thee, cause it to happen before me this day and show kindness to my master, Avraham, that he will meet the girl that is supposed to become the bride. Now, why would the servant of Abraham have hesitation as he is praying for this guidance, for this insight? Well, because we know that Abraham was of the opinion that if he couldn't find a bride for Isaac, if there was not going to be a successor for that line, that indeed the servant might inherit along with or instead of Isaac. So by the servant carrying out this deed, he is essentially taking himself out of the running as being a potential heir to Abraham. And we can imagine, again, the materialism that would put a person, a little hesitant to give up that option, to let go of that. And then that's not Genesis, that should say Leviticus 8:23. Moses is inaugurating the temple and Aaron as the Kohen Gadol, and he slaughtered it, meaning the cow that was used during this part of the service. And Moshe took of its blood and put it on the tip of Aaron's right ear and upon the thumb of his right hand and upon the great toe of his right foot. This act is the moment where Moses is irrevocably handing over the Kohanic right, the right to be the priest, to his brother Aaron. And there must have been some element of ambivalence. Moses, humble though he was essentially ceding a huge portion of the authority and the prestige of the newly inaugurated Mishkan and all of the sacrificial services that were beginning. And that is hard, even for somebody like Moses, even for somebody of his amazing and outstanding characteristic. He still must have had a pull that was saying, do you really want to give this up? Do you really want to let your brother do this instead of you? Do you really want to say goodbye to all of the food that's going to come from the sacrifices, as well as the honor and glory that comes from serving like this? Are you sure about this? And of course, Moses did go ahead, and indeed, in all of these cases, the right outcome eventually prevailed, but with a struggle. And that struggle is something that we're going to come back to. But I want to look a little bit more at our case here in this week's Torah portion of Joseph's struggle in particular. So now that we've seen the other places where Shalshelet shows up, let's look at Joseph alone again. To be with her, right? That was the question. Would he be with her? Well, he was careful even to avoid being alone with her until it happened that he had to do so against his will in order to take care of the needs of the house, as was his job. It happened on that same day that no one else remained in the house. So we have to ask, and Rashbam is answering the question for us, if he was trying to resist, how was he resisting? Did he just say no once, but she kept pressuring? Did he have to keep saying no again and again? Well, more than just saying no, he actually tried to work hard to never be alone with her because he knew there was the potential for this to become a more serious confrontation, which turns out to have been absolutely right. But unfortunately, he had no choice but to be alone with her on that particular day. And indeed, the Talmud goes on to try and give us more of an understanding of Joseph's struggle, of how he resisted in this process. It was told of Yosef the virtuous that the wife of Potiphar every day endeavored to entice him with words. The garment she put on for him in the morning, she did not wear in the evening. Those she put on in the evening, she did not wear in the morning, meaning she kept changing her outfits to try and make herself more attractive and more beautiful to him. She said to him, "Yield to me." He said, "No." She said, "I shall have you imprisoned." He said, "The Lord releases the bound," quoting from Psalm 146. She said, "I shall bend your proud stature," meaning with more labor. He replied, "The Lord raises those who are bowed down," continuing to quote from the Psalm. She said, "I shall blind your eyes." He replied, "The Lord opens the eyes of the blind." She offered him 1,000 talents of silver to make him yield to her, to lie with her, to be near her. But he would not listen to her, not to lie with her in this world, not to be with her in the world to come. So Joseph is seen as resolving against her because he is knowledgeable of Psalm 146. Now, if you've done your chronology of the Tanakh, you'll know that the Psalms were written long after Joseph was dead. However, this is a common technique that is found in rabbinic midrash, where they assume, usually I think with very good understanding, that those of the earlier generation would have been aware of the principles that would later inspire the psalmist to come up with these particular phrasings that are found in the book of Psalms. So yes, it may seem anachronistic, but the idea that God releases the bound, that God helps those bowed, that God gives sight to the blind, those are eternal principles. And Joseph, as somebody devoted to God, would have been aware of them, even if he didn't have Psalm 146 in front of him. Now, that second half, that he would not lie with her in this world, nor to be with her in the world to come, that is trying to explain the apparent redundancy that is found in in verse 10, where it says that she requested for him to lie with her and to be with her. And that seems to be a little redundant. So the Midrash says, with that redundancy, that her enticement was that he be with her in this world, meaning that they have intimacy here now, and that he be with her in the world to come, meaning that he give up his share of the world to come because of his desire to be with her now. That thus they will both be in the same boat, so to speak, when passing from this world. That he will have lost his portion of the world to come for having committed this crime of adultery, but more importantly, not only committing the crime, but doing so in a way that renounced the idea of God altogether. For after all, he knew that God did not want him to commit adultery, so to do so would be an act of rebellion, not merely an act of sin. So thus, not with her now, not with her later, he recognizes what's at stake. Should he give in, is more than just the wrongness of the moment, but a more lasting rejection of his true identity. Questions or comments? All right, so the Talmud continues to talk about this conflict between them. And it came to pass about this time that he went into the house to do his work, as we read. Rabbi Yochanan said, this teaches that both Yosef and Potiphar's wife had the intention of acting immorally, right? Rabbi Yochanan says, look. Joseph is setting himself up here. He is putting himself in the place in order to have this activity. Better for him to have stayed out and not done the work if it meant that he could avoid being alone with her. That some part of Joseph wanted to be with her. Maybe not enough to override it in the end, but enough to put him in a position where he would at least be vulnerable to that confrontation. He went into the house to do his work. Rav and Shmuel disagree, right? They continue in this discussion. One said that it really means to do his work, meaning that he was just doing his job. But the other said that he went to satisfy his desires. And the other says that no, to do his work means that he was finally prepared to give in to her and to be with her. And there was none of the men of the house. Is it possible that there was no man in a huge house like that of this wicked Potiphar? Right? What does it mean to say there's no one there? How did that happen at all? It was taught in the school of Rabbi Ishmael. That day was their feast day, and they all had gone to their idolatrous temple. But she had pretended to be ill because she thought, I shall not have an opportunity like today for Yosef to associate with me. And she caught him by his garment, saying. So the idea here is that this was all staged, that she was laying in wait and had worked things out perfectly. Him, not being an idolater, would not be going to participate, and she, feigning illness, would be able to stay home and have him all to herself. She thought that his main reason for resistance was because he might get caught. That the main reason that he wasn't giving in to her pressure was because he didn't want to get in trouble with his master. And so she waited until the perfect moment to arrange things just so that he would be able to have relations with her without any risk of getting caught, because she wasn't going to admit it and he wasn't going to admit it, and no one else would be around to witness it. And with that in mind, some of the rabbis say Joseph should have realized what was about to happen. That if this woman has been saying, come with me, come with me, come with me, come with me, over and over and over, and you finally see there's a day when it's just you and her all alone in the house, run, right? Because if you go in, that means you are at least admitting part of you wants to see what will happen. And we can applaud again Joseph for resisting, but this puts more in perspective that idea of the maybe, right? That there is this back and forth struggle within him. And sometimes he ended up in trouble because of allowing himself to step in. But it's debated, right? Because did he or did he not have some part in this? Was he completely vulnerable or was he not vulnerable? It may surprise you to know that there are other teachings that say that, he was a little bit more to blame than we might have been giving him credit for. From Bereshit Rabbah, the Midrash, as soon as he saw himself as a ruler, he began to pamper himself with food and drink and curl his hair. Remember, this is the boy who was already always doted upon by his father and who had dreams of greatness over his family. And was so arrogant that he was willing to share those dreams with the rest of his family. That's what got him in this position in the first place. So here that he is finally enjoying a taste of power, albeit while being a slave, he might have begun to get a bit full of himself. Said the Holy One, blessed be he, your father mourns, yet you curl your hair? I shall arouse the bear against you. Thereupon his master's wife cast her eyes upon Yosef. So the Midrash is trying to say that he only got into this trouble because he was himself drawing more attention, because he was becoming arrogant about himself because of his position of power, his standing, his status, that he was being tempted before he became a temptation to her. He was being tempted by this feeling of power. Yes?
We end the parasha with, and Joseph is forgotten. Is this where Joseph is forgetting his own upbringing? So perhaps there's a lovely symmetry of Joseph forgetting his lessons of shouldn't put yourself in this position, because certainly we can see that is not a wise thing. So Joseph in some ways is forgetting his father, who's in mourning, forgetting the moral teachings, and then he ends up being forgotten himself.
Exactly. This is his not just forgetting the moral teachings, but forgetting the power, the power of the temptation to make you easily forget your meaning, those teachings. As we see in Pirkei Avot, jealousy, lusting, and honor remove a man from the world. Again, this idea of removing from this world and the world to come, the idea that these emotions are the entryway towards doing wrong things. How? Well, as Sikta Rabati says, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, uses any opening to lead a person toward transgression. For example, it'll whisper in your ear, why should you give to tzedakah? Give to your own children instead. Now, is that an evil sentence? No, of course not. Well, obviously, you're supposed to take care of your children. But if you give into it by saying, you're right, I really shouldn't share with other people, I should only give to my children, that becomes the first step towards becoming a more selfish person. And little by little, you will eventually be giving not to your children or anyone else, but keeping it only for yourself. Likewise, it whispers, you're a great man. You demean your position by visiting someone who is ill, but of a low station. So you think to yourself, it's not really appropriate, me being the rabbi, the president, the CEO, that I should go and visit the person who's low on whatever social totem pole you think you have in your head. And eventually you're going to not visit the person above them and above them and above them. And eventually you're visiting no one because you don't consider it dignified for someone as honored as you to lower yourself down to that position. And that, of course, is that gateway drug, if you will, towards the Yetzer Hara having much more control over your life. And it begins not by saying, quick, go sleep with your master's wife. It begins by saying, you're really something now. This is amazing. Look at how great you have done. You have risen as a slave to being very important, almost like a free man. You know what? You deserve to look a little better. You deserve to be a little bit more pampered. You deserve to enjoy the things that you've earned. I mean, after all, think of what you lost when your brother sold you. Have a little more, have a little better. You know, you really deserve it. And at that point, it becomes more obvious and there are more opportunities for further problems, like catching the eye of Mrs. Potiphar. Is everyone following the thread? All right. So does that mean that Joseph was a bad guy? Does that mean that Joseph was a bad person? Does that mean that his shalshelet, his hesitation, his refusal of I refuse, does that mean that we should condemn him? No, because it just means he's human. It means that he is a human being, and a human being will, at every point of life, continue to have different inclinations that will often pull them towards a bad direction. And that doesn't make them bad people. It makes them human people that continually will have to struggle. Now, you might be thinking, and indeed this is part of our tradition, so why not just say, let's get rid of all of that type of thought? Why not just, every time a bad thought comes into my head, why not just simply cut it out and remove it or pretend like it's not there, or hide it, suppress it, bury it, deep it down far as I can possibly go? Why even notice that I had that particular thought? Just ignore it, pretend it like it's not there. The put your hands over your ears and hands over your eyes sort of response. Well, the rabbis have had that idea, and this abridged version of their midrash can tell us why that doesn't work. They said, since this is a time, meaning the story happened at Yom Kippur, in which we enjoy favor, let us seek mercy for this one, meaning the Yetzer Hara, who tempts to transgress the law. Now, that seek mercy is a bit of a euphemism. They sought mercy, and he was handed over to them, meaning they have captured the literal feeling of the evil inclination, this Yetzer Hara. They have it controlled now, right? They have it. And he, or it, said to them, see, if you kill me, the world will come to an end. Now, you might think, well, that's just, lies. But they put him into prison for 3 days, and then they went looking for a day-old egg in the whole land of Israel, but it was not to be found. They said, what should we do? If we kill him, the world will come to an end. Can we seek mercy by halves? Heaven does not bestow mercy by halves. So they put out his eyes and sent him off. So the issue that's happening here is that the rabbis are recognizing that the Yetzer Hara serves a functional purpose, a biological purpose, if you will, within the world. That it is something that should not be suppressed or driven from our mind and pretended like it's not there, or buried so deep that we act like we never hear it. But instead, it is something that will be there, constantly pinging away and making its claims and its utterances. But in ways that we can control, we can recognize and use it for good. How? We see again from the Bereshit Rabbah, and God saw everything that he had made. Behold, it was very good. This includes the Yetzer Hara, right? After all, God made everything. We don't believe in some separate dualistic power like Satan creating the evil of the world. Everything in the world was made by God, including the evil inclination. But how can we say that it is good? Well, but for the Yetzer Hara, we would not build a house, nor marry, nor have children, nor engage in business. That little extra push that comes biologically, instinctually, that says, I want to be intimate with someone. I want to have kids. I want to have a little more in my life of comfort and security. I would like to not live in a cave or just lay out in the middle of a forest. all of that is a spur which gets us moving. The problem, of course, is that if we let that spur become the whip, if we let that spur become the main driver, then we end up in catastrophe. The struggle itself is not the problem. The struggle itself is embedded within what it is to be human. But it is how we deal with that struggle, how we guide ourselves through that struggle, that we are able to choose the path that we will take. If we allow that spurring to drive us beyond the limits of what is permitted, so we have a spur for intimacy, but we are driven and we give in towards adultery, then we have catastrophe. But if we take the spur for intimacy and we seek a good and healthy relationship with someone that we can be intimate with within marriage and have that joy within that sanctification, then it is a blessing. It is not the urge in and of itself that is the problem. It is when we let the urge tempt us bit by bit by bit past the border of what should be permitted. The same way that we saw in the earlier teaching, don't give to other people, only give to your kids. Don't visit that person, he's beneath you. That those are just the first steps that take us past the acceptable boundaries. And if we put a limit, if we hear it, and we can differentiate between when it is telling me to do right and when it is telling me to do wrong, or when it's telling me to do something that can be right, then we will be in a much better position, that we can guide ourselves. And indeed, to guide ourselves, we use the teachings of our trope. That's one of the reasons why the shalshelet is there, is so to remind us that there is this tension and drive within Joseph and within all of us, and that just as he was able to overcome it eventually, so too we can. That is meant to be a much more important lesson than Joseph was so pure and saintly that he was never tempted at all, because that is simply unrealistic and unhelpful to the rest of us who, of course, feel these temptations in the whole range of human activities. And that trope opens that door. Now, there is, I just had to make sure that you understood, there is also another reason why we can sometimes interpret that phrase about having the trope from Ezekiel. And I just wanted to make sure we could just see that at the end, because I think it's another good message to remind us. It's a slightly different topic, though. So be prepared for a little bit of a change. Abaye strongly objects to this. He is objecting to our very first line, that it's all about the trope. Instead, just because one does not know how to make his voice pleasant, you read concerning him and judgments whereby they should not live, right? He's like, look. Yes, the trope is important, but don't make too big a deal out of the melodies of it, the music of it. The music is nice, but you're not going to condemn that this person is like perverting the word of God. Rather, read that verse from Ezekiel in a different way. The verse should be understood in accordance with the statement of Rav Mishar Shia, who said concerning two Torah scholars who dwell in the same city and are not pleasant to one another in the matters of halacha, and they quarrel, so too I gave them statutes that were not good and judgments whereby they should not live. That if you have two people who are both learned and knowledgeable and they fight not for the sake of heaven, but for the sake of their own honor or for the sake of being able to dominate the other, then regardless of the wisdom they may think they have, what they are demonstrating, what they are showing by example, is the opposite of what God tried to teach us. And that is what drives us from this world. Those types of pointless status-seeking quarrels, which can plague even rabbis, can plague even scholars. There is always that temptation, especially in that circle, of people being a little set upon their honor, of their status within the community, that can sometimes put people in confrontation, which is not ennobling of them and is certainly not helping put Torah in the world. Any questions or comments? All right, then I will leave it there for today, and I hope everybody has an amazing Thanksgiving. And a reminder, we do have Mishnah tonight, but there is no Pathway to Judaism tomorrow evening, because I hope people will be enjoying that day of thankfulness.
Thank you, Rabbi. I look forward to hearing the Shashtalat chanted this Shabbat. It brings a renewed understanding. Thank you.
Always. Thanks you for being there.
Rabbi.